Chapter 6. Further results of worship. So far we have been dealing mainly with the externals of worship, and it is to be feared that some highly refined and sensitive souls might have been displeased thereby. These worthy persons wish to have the kernel, the very essence or the fruit of worship, without having to deal with any shell or bark, the skin or other outer coverings. It is true that mere formal performance of worship, unaccompanied by the pure and fervent spirit, counts for nothing, and that the spirit is the essence. But so far we have had to deal with externals, as externals are indispensable to clothe, embody, and convey the spirit from person to person, from place to place, from stage to stage, and even from age to age, just as husk and shell serve a similar purpose in nature. It is the nectar we want, but the liquid nectar comes only in a cup as its necessary vehicle, just as the grain we need comes and must come from chaff and cannot be grown without the husk. Sweetness is what we want, but except by getting sugar or other sweet article, sweetness is not got. This is so patent. Sugar stands for sweetness, so worship stands or should stand for the best form of worship, that worship which is in every item is saturated by fervent admiration, reverence, or love. It is on the supposition that this is well understood that worship has been and is referred to till now as a highly desirable object, as conferring on individuals, the country, and humanity what is badly and urgently needed by them. But still, to satisfy the demands of these specially sensitive readers referred to above, a few words on the nature and essence of worship may be added here to stress their importance. Indian listeners would appreciate worship better if we take them to the corresponding Sanskrit words and note what they connote. These words are puja and upasana. These are well understood terms in constant use. We say a person is doing puja when he offers flowers, water, food, scents, and praise to a person or an image of divine being. Yet, all the while, that worshipper is not acting like a robot machine, but is simultaneously using speech and thought. He utters words, mostly mantras and slokas, in his mind and turns to their meanings for most of the time. Occasionally, he may be merging himself in the object of worship mentally, attaining purna laya, or feeling perfect bliss and forgetting all ideas of his little self, being the actor. Most listeners would have admired the Pariya Purana, the simple hunter Kanapa's worship of a stone linga. He just saw the linga on a hill covered by leaves, flowers, and water, used by some adorer who had made formal worship of the stone with those leaves and flowers. At once, by some purva vasana, some trace of memory from past births, probably devotion or bhakti, entered into his soul, and he had a powerful urge to go to the lingam and worship it. He had no object to gain, since objects are expressed in the sankalpa, or initial portion of every puja, but simply felt that the irresistible impulse to go to the image and to feel its beneficent presence. What was the worship he offered? The devotee, as a personality, judges the worshipped God as another personality, only by standards and ideas applying to oneself. So besides leaves and flowers and abhiksha water brought in his mouth, as he had no vessel, he offered roasted flesh to God, as that was the food he liked and lived on. Whatever is a man's food is also the food of his God. But however repulsive this flesh was to the orthodox Shiva Acharya who was worshipping the image there, it was not repulsive to the deity that Kanapa worshipped in the linga. For the deity appreciated Kanapa's unmotivated but powerful love, and to prove the superiority of worship with such love to cold formal worship, albeit with Veda mantras, the deity as Shiva began to bleed in his eyes. Kanapa, who saw it at once, plucked out one of his eyes and placed it on the image in lieu of the injured or bleeding eye. Then Shiva made his second eye in the image bleed. Nothing daunted Kanapa, and started to pluck out his second eye for replacing the second eye of God. But in order to be sure of the place where the second eye of the image was, which after plucking out his own second eye he would not be able to see, Kanapa placed his shod foot with its chapel near the second eye. Then Shiva appeared and stopped this sacrifice of the second eye. And the formal worshipper noticed how greatly God, Shiva, esteemed the love freely flowing from Kanapa's heart, and how much superior it was to his formal external worship with all the Vedic rites and mantras and ceremonies. Sri Shankaracharya in his Sivananda Lahari refers to this superiority in the often quoted verse, which means, God Shiva felt the touch of the worn-out chapel delightfully thrilling. The water given for the bath, the abhikshaka, carried by the hunter in his mouth, mixed with his saliva, was enjoyed as a divine ablution. The flesh, which previously tested by tasting had been found good and offered by the hunter, was felt to be as good as newly cooked food. Well, what cannot devotion achieve? A forest hunter was esteemed as the highest worshipper. Thus, it is the spirit that matters. It is needless to quote other stanzas to illustrate the same truth. When all is said and done, one must recollect that Kanapars are not found everywhere, and everyone cannot imitate Kanapa. The ordinary man has to remember that his gentle plant of devotion has to be grown and tended and hedged in with considerable care, and that for that purpose the regular forms of worship and the usual directions for the growth of devotion by attending pujas and bhajanas and other ceremonies must be followed for a long time before attaining full fruition of bhakti, and that especially the 9 modes of worship mentioned in the Bhagavata and stressed by Sri Sai Baba often have to be attended to and followed. In setting out these 9 forms, one can see how the external and internal are inextricably interwoven and combined, and how one gradually progresses with lower and external forms till his inner kernel of devotion attains maturity and perfection. The 9 modes are Shravana, listening to accounts of the deeds of God, his avatars and saints; Kirtana, of Vishnu, that is, reciting these or repeating God's names in praise; Smarana, which is constantly recalling these especially uttering God's names. Padasivanam, which is the falling at the feet of God and saints and sages. Archana, the formal worship, such with flowers and water and food and scents, and the 16 upacharas, and the vandana, the prostration before God and the saints. And this next is the dasya, the service, doing every work for God or the saints or sages, and sakya, remaining in the company of God or the saints and sages. And the 9th is Atma Divadan, the surrender of the little self, forgetting oneself entirely in the contemplation of God after formally offering that ego self or ego consciousness as a gift to God. The devout listener would like to have a further sketch of the nature and the works of devotion at this stage before we deal with the expansion of the mere system of worship of Sai Baba throughout the country and its diversification. So once again, we may refer to Sri Adi Shankarya, who, though a perfect adept in the metaphysics of Advaita and an authority in respect of the impersonal absolute or Brahman, in his numerous works, has also shown his grip of the subject of the Bhakti Marga. That is how he describes what Bhakti is. When he says, as the seeds of the ankolam tree or plant are re-grasped by the parent tree, as the parent magnetic block attracts needles, one behind another, as the chaste wife clasps her husband, as the tendril creeper clings to the adjoining tree and mounts upward and outward, as the waters of the rivers are forever drawn downward and downward till they reach the ocean and get inextricably and indistinguishably lost in it. Similarly, the heart of the devotee longs after the divine feet of the Pasupati, the god Shiva, to be ever there. This is called bhakti. The ideas of Sri Shankara are very well thought out, and we see in example after example how bhakti is to be understood as a natural force which is found working in all creations, namely the vegetable, animal, mineral, and human. Each illustration takes bhakti one stage further up. First comes the tendency of the ankolam plant and its seed. After the seed is first shed from the parent tree, it gets reattached to the tree. Thus, the tendency, even in vegetables, is to get back to the original source and get reabsorbed in it. That is the real nature of devotion in the human being also, for we are parts, or sparks from God, and are drawn by a natural force to look to and reach the original source of all creation and of ourselves, namely God, this force being devotion. The second example is from Ayashkanta, that is the magnetic stone. The magnet, when approached by a needle, magnetizes it and then draws it to itself and converts it into a magnet. That is, it gives parts of itself, its force, to the newcomer, and that in turn acts in a similar way towards other needles. And thus a string of even 7 needles might be found attached one behind another to a big magnet. This shows the nature of devotion. The jiva's contact with the parent body is ever to strengthen devotion to God, and every growing bhakta tends to attract others and impart his devotion to them and through them to others ad infinitum. These are inert pieces of creation, and even these exhibit the nature of devotion. The third is human. The chaste wife longs for her husband, and his slightest absence for even a short period makes her full of unrest and pant for his presence. And when that presence is regained, she is full of bliss and joy and sticks to him. This again is quite descriptive of bhakti. The Bhagavata treats all devotees as females, such as gopis, and the only male in the universe is God or Krishna. So in the Rasa Krida, Krishna by his flute or magic sound draws all the gopis to himself, and they form a ring around him. Between every two gopis is found Krishna, and between every two Krishnas is a gopi. That is, each gopi sees only Krishna on either side of her, and not the other gopis. Perfect white heat of love conveys everything into Krishna. It is converted. This feminine devotion to the Purusha is the loftiest love and bliss known to humanity, and that, therefore, is the best way of indicating what devotion is. Next comes the creeper. The creeper is a very feeble tendril, and it must be sending up tendrils which intuitively clasp a strong and powerful tree next to it. The wind will shake out and break the creeper to pieces. But when it twirls around and round a big tree, the wind can do no harm. The natural tendency of the creeper is to go further and further upward and upward, till the top of the tree is reached. This helps it to get more light from the sun, more of air and more of freedom and safety from animals which will bite and eat up the creeper. In a similar way is the tendency of a weak human being who resorts to God as the source of his strength, just as the creeper resorts to the neighboring tree as the source of its strength, and clings to God and ever tends to mount up higher and higher in his spiritual levels to achieve nobler and nobler objects, and to transform himself into more and more of the likeness of God, till he reaches full sarupam. So long as bhakti is in the lower stages, there is the danger of his bhakti being disturbed or his safety being affected by other creatures or beings. But when he mounts up higher and higher and reaches the top stages, there is no more danger to his existence or perfection. Lastly comes the example of the rivers. All of the above-mentioned examples are all objects which retain their identity as separate from the objects to which they are drawn. In the last, that is, through the rivers, the perfection of the current of devotion is attained by losing one's own entity or existence in that of the divine, or the end of the course. The river is inevitably drawn down. Does water go back or upward? It is drawn downward, and finally it meets the ocean. The waters of the rivers were originally part of the ocean, and after being held up in the form of water vapor, cloud, and rain, they take the shape of a river. So it is the oceanic waters that flow through the rivers and get back to their original source. The devotion of the river, which has issued out of the immense, endless, infinite expanse called the ocean, makes it get back to that ocean and be lost in it. Once the rivers, such as the Ganges and the Indus, get into the ocean, they cannot be pieced out again as Ganges or Indus water. Purna Laya is the end of devotion, and that is obtained by the jivas surrendering themselves, that is, making Atma Nivadana, which is the 9th mode mentioned in the Navadita Bhakti. That is both devotion and also absorption. After that, there is nothing further to reach. Thus, the various stages, attitudes, and relations of a bhakta can be very well dwelt upon and learnt by studying the above illustrations and applying them to oneself. Another stanza, which may be quoted next, sets out the names of a number of loving bhaktas so that they may ever remain in one's heart and show how bhakti achieves its ends. The end of bhakti is not achieved by the offer of money to God, or by mere learning, or by age or beauty. God does not want any of these. God wants only your heart, that is, yourself, and He will not be satisfied with anything else. The stanza runs as follows. As for the hunter, Kanapa, what acharya or religious course of conduct had he? For Dhruva, what was his age? For the elephant Jadendra, what education or degrees and titles had he? Had Vidura, the favorite of Krishna, any qualifications in respect of caste? He was the son of a slave or dancing girl. For the king of the Yadavas called Ugrasena, who was favored by Krishna, what manliness had he? He was a great coward. For Kubja, who also was favored by Krishna, had she any great beauty? She was deformed in person. For Sudama, known as Kuchela, he also was favored by Krishna. Had he any wealth? Therefore, God is pleased with and wants only bhakti or devotion. God is captured by prem, or true love. The above stanza refers to well-known bhaktas who received great help or favor from Krishna or God on account of their bhakti. One's profession or conduct, that is, whether one is a hunter or a Brahmin, whether one is young or old, whether one is highly learned or a creature without education, whether one is high caste or the son of a slave, or a brave man or a coward, or one has beauty or wealth, none of these are the reason for God's help and favor. God is pleased by bhakti alone, and bhakti alone can capture Him. This contains the essence of the doctrine of bhakti, or devotion, and therefore earnest listeners who are anxious to study the history of Sai Baba, who realized in himself the perfection of Godhead by attaining Purna Laya, concentrating his mind always on God with intense love from his earliest period of life, and thereby attaining the ultimate state, so that he could say and could exhibit all the powers of God, would find use in the above stanzas. Sai identified himself with Krishna and with every other form of God. As the object of everyone should be to please God in Sai form or in any other form, one may note how, in point of historical fact, from this biography, numbers were drawn to Sai Baba and achieved the love of Sai Baba, and thereby achieved every object of human existence. The succeeding chapters of this book would deal with the details of a large number of devotees being drawn to and benefiting from Baba, and would fully illustrate the truth of the above verses. At present, we have sufficiently satisfied highly sensitive listeners who wish to have the essence of Sai Baba's Marga placed before them before we deal with the expansion of the Sai movement and the details of persons who approached him and the problems that arise for consideration in the life of Baba.